Welcome to Theology Thursday, an ecumenical space for students to discuss matters of faith and theology.
I'm your host, Connor Grubbs.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Mock.
And I'm your co-host, Johnny Grubbs.
Hey, so this is the first time that we have done an episode not during one of our official seasons. Season 4 will be starting in August, so we're kind of taking a break right now, doing some stuff behind the scenes to get ready for that. But in light of recent events, it became apparent very quickly that this was something worth talking about and that we didn't want to wait on. You're seeing this being filmed and recorded, or maybe you're hearing it, in our new space for recording these podcasts, and it's not finished yet. There's a lot that we're doing to try and, up the quality for Season 4, but we just wanted to go ahead and address this with the equipment that we've had and that we've been using for the past 3 seasons, so we're not, quite ready from a technical standpoint to be making new episodes, but this was just so important. We didn't want to wait. This is, when it comes to race issues and things like that, so many people address it from purely a political standpoint, and they view it as purely a political issue. And I've said many times, this is a kingdom issue. And sure, politics and these different things play a part in it, but at the end of the day, if this was purely a political issue and I wasn't a Christian, I don't think I would address it. As a Christian, and this is another thing I've said, that white privilege means that as a white man, I have the option to ignore this. I would argue that as a Christian, I don't. As Christians, we don't. So we're all in a state of learning, and we're planning on having some people on the podcast to come and teach us some things. And we're continually going to be in a state of learning. We're not claiming to be the experts on this. We never do claim to be the experts on any of the things we talk about. However, the church has to talk about this. It is the Christian church's responsibility to speak out and stand for the oppressed. That's God's heart, and therefore I want that to be my heart. And I put up a short Facebook post about this when all of it started, just because a lot of black voices that I really respected, a lot of mentors and friends in my life were saying, hey, we've been talking about this forever. We need white people to say something about it. And so I just said something. It was very simple. I was shocked at the response that I got. I don't think I was ready to see how many of my friends on Facebook, or people, not even friends on Facebook, just anybody that found my post. It was a public post. I mean, how many white people who claim to be Christians are blatant racist? I was not ready for that. And I've never really spoken on this before because I'd been kind of indoctrinated in that mindset that this is a political issue, and I don't speak to political issues. We've made a commitment, even though oftentimes before and after recording a podcast we'll talk about political issues, to not talk about that on the podcast, and that's still a commitment that we're holding to. Again, we're not addressing this as a political issue because it's so much more than that. So anyway, I say that to say I finally was like, I can't stay silent about that. It's a simple Facebook post. I mean, that's like, that's nothing. I mean, that's barely scratching the surface of what we need to do. But I was just really surprised, and I think that might be part of the reason that a lot of people, well-meaning and well-intentioned people, choose to stay silent, because when we were talking about this before, even with Ryan, like just being surprised at the different responses that people get and that people have, and not wanting to maybe lose friends or relationships with friends and family members. But honestly, if people are choosing this as a hill to die on and they're not willing to learn or change their perspective, I'm not sure that that's a relationship that's worth pursuing much anyway, because some people, as I'm learning, are just so set in their minds about this. We want to continue to learn and to grow, and so Johnny has a lot of stuff that he's going to share just based on different books and things that he's read and learned over the years, and we're going to discuss that and hopefully continue to engage this in a healthy and an open-minded way. But I just say all that to say this is kind of the first time that I've chosen to speak out, and I've just been shocked at the response from people who claim to be Christians. it's just bizarre to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. I save these tweets because I think it's important. Kind of my first exposure to this conversation, at least on a deeper level. I think Ryan was kind of mentioning it earlier when we were talking beforehand. It's like, I guess I've always kind of believed and had the perception of systemic racism, but maybe not have like all the details articulated and mapped out in my mind and in my heart. I think that's where I was for a long time, and Phil Fisher, and I'll go ahead and reference it. It's now called the Holy Post Podcast, but I think that retrospectively they've called it that too. But episode 267 of their podcast is called Race in America, and I encourage you to give it a listen. I'm going to kind of go over some of the things that are from that and from other places. But that was when I first realized, this is a systemic issue, and because it's a systemic issue, nobody's tried to say, hey, we need to fix that. There's been no, and despite people of color coming out and saying, hey, listen, systemically we are oppressed and there is such a thing as white privilege, nothing has really changed in that. But anyway, he did this episode, and this is what he said recently. This is a summary of numerous conversations that I've had over the last week. This is Phil Fisher on Twitter. From the other side, from people, his constituency, why do you say Black Lives Matter? Are you a Marxist? And then Phil Fisher said, no, I said it because it's true. And then the other constituency would say, why not say all lives matter? And Phil Fisher said, because we're bringing attention to a group of people who have suffered serious injustice for a long, long time. And the other side says, but if we bring attention to them, they'll feel like victims. And Phil Fisher says, I'm pretty sure they already feel like victims. Being victimized for 400 years has that effect. And there's this kind of long, awkward pause. And then the guy goes, well, I like VeggieTales. I'm sad you've become a leftist. And he adds to that, in parentheses, the sound of my head banging against the desk. Because he would say, I'm not a leftist. And like we said, it's not, I read those tweets to say, this is not a political issue. This is an issue of truth and then Christian responsibility. And Jesus said, quoting Jesus, he said, the truth will set you free. And there cannot be emancipation from systemic racism. There cannot be emancipation from subversive racism if we don't look the truth in the eye, face it, and then ask, okay, what can we do to be a part of it? And before I get into any of this, I have to say, I will never understand what it's like to be Black in this country. I'll never understand what it's like, to go exercise, say, I ride my scooter, so I'm not going to say go for a run, right? But I know I have friends, and they'll say, who are people of color, and they'll say, well, I want to know when my husband's going out to run, to exercise, and I want to know when they're coming back. When I say I'm going on my scooter, Sue Ellen's kind of like, okay, there's not really an issue of, hey, is somebody going to bother me or, there are people who are afraid of going outside their house. I'll never understand what that's like. The only reason I'm speaking out is because this is a human issue, it is a Christian issue, and we need people from both sides of the equation, both white people and people of color, acknowledging that there is a problem and that we need to stand united against this.
And unfortunately, I think in a lot of Christian circles, there's churches that are predominantly white and predominantly Black, and unless a white person starts the conversations, the majority isn't going to have it.
Right.
And so I think as pastors, as ministry leaders, people need to address this. And again, if you're somebody who, I don't talk about politics in the pulpit, great. You still need to address it because that's not what this is. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah.
So I'm just going to give one example today because like Carter said, we want to interview other people, other perspectives, and get this kind of understanding that is from pastors and leaders that are wiser than us.
Yeah. And before you get, we want to learn, and one of the things I want to really encourage you to do, and encourage myself to, I've been encouraging myself to do as we go through this, is I think that we often become very defensive, like, I'm not racist, I don't hate anyone, but you're not doing anything about it either. And we've all heard that, well, if you're not doing something to fight this, then you're part of the problem, that kind of mentality. What I really just want, and it would help, I think, if you define kind of the idea of subversive racism versus systemic racism. Don't be so quick to be so defensive, because maybe without realizing it, there are certain patterns of behavior and thought in your life that are racist. And I think for a lot of us, because we're just born into it, we don't always recognize that. And that's something. So could you kind of talk about the difference between those two things?
Yeah, I'm going to be bold here, though, to do it. I mean, subversive racism is really kind of looking things like white privilege in the eye. Subversive racism is having somebody explain why we have benefited as white people from systemic racism. Whether, not that we did it on purpose, but just that we have. And somebody to look at and say, try to defend themselves against it, or say, well, no, I didn't benefit from systemic racism and all these kind of things. It's kind of looking at the facts and trying to defend their morality when their morality is not even really being attacked. Mm-hmm. And what it does is it says, I'm not listening. It creates a problem.
Yeah. It's not calling an individual's morality into question. It's more saying, okay, this is history. Mm-hmm. This is facts. And, maybe it's your ancestors' fault. Maybe it's generations before you. But what are you going to do about it? Because it's here.
Right. And like when slavery and stuff was like addressed, like, I mean, obviously there were some people who were slave owners who were saying, okay, they had a choice to make. But at the end of the day, like, this is how reform has come throughout history. We've never said, oh, that's not my problem. That this thing was created by my forefathers. Well, yeah, but you're alive now, and as believers, we have an obligation and a calling, even a joy, to bring the kingdom of God, which is a diverse and beautiful place. So I think in Revelation, I look to Revelation when John looks and he sees all that will be in the kingdom of God when it comes in its fullness. And he specifically says, and I saw a great multitude of people from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation. And so he is aware of race and of color even in the kingdom. So the kingdom is diverse. And so we have to embrace this diversity and love it and cherish it as a beautiful thing. And if there's division, if there's unrest, if there's not peace, we as believers have a direct responsibility to encourage it.
And that's such a huge part of the reason why, like, biblically, theologically, Theology Thursday, theologically speaking, the idea of colorblindness doesn't work.
No.
God's not colorblind. There are God-given attributes of every culture that are to be celebrated because they are part of God's creation, and they will be celebrated for eternity.
They're retained in the kingdom. Read it. It's in Revelation.
Yeah. and everybody's going to be there, and it's going to be awesome. We get to celebrate each other's cultural differences, and it becomes this one big, beautiful picture of praise and of worship and of God's glory. So, I don't want to, the colorblindness thing, we don't even need to go there because it's dumb.
And I would recommend a resource before I get into this too, like too far into this. If the words white privilege irks you, or if the idea, even what I said, that we have inadvertently benefited from systemic racism as white people, if those sentences irk you, I get it. But I encourage you to start, as you look into resources, first of all, be willing. Are you willing to look at resources and try to understand our history? Even as far back as 400 years ago, but even more recently, we're going to start in the 30s today. Are you willing to do that? And a great book to start with is White Fragility. And it just kind of explains why we get defensive. It kind of gives credence to that. But then it also explains why we shouldn't get defensive as white people, how we should understand this issue a little bit more broadly and constantly be willing to learn why systemic racism exists. And I think, honestly, that's the first hurdle we have to overcome right now in this country. Yeah. It is getting past, is just admitting, wow, there is a disparity. That's what, there's a disparity between what it means to be a white person in this country and what it means to be a person of color. If we can start there, and it's hard to get people there. It's hard to get people to admit there is a disparity. Which is crazy, because I'm about to share why just historically there is. Yeah,
it's really hard. I think just starting from a point of we're willing to learn is so important because, man, go ahead. But yes, I can't stress. There probably will be listeners of this podcast who are angry that we're even releasing this.
Right.
And we may lose some followers. I just don't care at this point. I don't understand why people are still so set in their ways. And you know what? We haven't talked specifically about the recent events, but I want to go ahead and address those just because
Sure.
I've seen a lot of people talking about, well, yeah, but George Floyd had a criminal record, or he was high when this happened, or blah, 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 blah. And there have been times in the past where we didn't have videos and we didn't know the whole story. And so in some of those instances, I kind of listened to that argument. With Ahmaud Arbery, by the way, not even law enforcement that time, as we all know, with these things, there's videos. Okay, we watched it. We watched it happen, and let's assume the worst about George Floyd for a second, just for the sake of argument. I'm just saying for the sake of argument, let's assume that he was high and that he knew that was a forged check. He was unarmed, he was unaggressive, and he was killed. And then some people go, well, we don't know that was a race issue. Maybe some people, okay, yeah, he was murdered, and what the cop did was wrong. But that doesn't mean it was racist. Maybe he was just a violent cop. Maybe he was just an aggressive cop. And I think what you were saying earlier is, yeah, but the fact that he even had that opportunity comes from a history of systemic racism.
Yeah, systemic racism put him in that situation. So even if we could argue that Chauvin isn't a racist, that whole situation was created because systemic racism exists, and he was at greater risk, just even statistically, because of that.
Right.
So the minute the cop showed up. So, and again, it's this idea that the truth will set us free, that we can have freedom in the truth, and I just look at facts, and that's all I'm looking at.
Right. And the other thing I want to address just about that specific situation, just because part of the reason we're even making this podcast is I want to make it clear, what my thoughts are moving forward. And if you don't like it and you don't want to listen to the podcast anymore, God bless you. The other thing people keep saying, you're just talking about like statistically. That is a hard word for me today. And that made me think everybody starts throwing around these statistics about black on black crime and all these things. First of all, the percentages don't really work there because there's less black people in America than white people anyway. And then people also talk about, well, white cops killing white people. It's true, there is police brutality that has nothing to do with racism. It's just people with PTSD who, haven't been getting psyche valves, and that needs to be dealt with too. But it doesn't change. Those are separate and real issues.
Right.
But it's changing the subject, and especially people, because I see this so often, is throwing out, well, the black on black crime, they're more likely to be killed by somebody of their own skin color in their neighborhood. Okay, but what we're talking about is people in authority who have taken an oath to protect people, who have, again, privilege. So that black on black crime and then just police brutality, of people in the same race, those are both, conversations that need to be had, but they don't negate this one.
Right. And I would also say some of those statistics that try to push that kind of narrative don't negate, they're not mutually exclusive to the other statistics about black
Right.
incarceration. Like, the other statistics still are true. So they're and I don't have them right in front of me, but if you watch episode 267, it's called Race in America, Phil Fisher podcast, he actually breaks down all the statistics about like incarceration and other things that show you that things are skewed. But that's not really what I wanted to talk about today, so that's why I'm not prepared to.
No, and again, much bigger discussion, but the reason I wanted to kind of preface this with that is just to say, this is where we stand on recent events, and this is why this is important to talk about, because a lot of people throw out these arguments to say, we don't even need to be having this conversation. Well, yeah, we do.
We do, and it's honestly, it's been a long time coming, and I even feel like apologetic for not being more bold about this. When I because I know this is such a hot button issue, the most I've done in my 5 years of like being a pastor in student ministry, I've worked longer in ministry, but over the past 5 years, the most I've done is sit down with my students and watch that podcast. And we went over the statistics and we went over why it's important for Christians to be aware of these things. And I had several students kind of push back, and other students had questions, and it all ended civilly. But I was like, okay, I got that off my chest, you know.
Right.
And that's like
I haven't spoken much about it either, and we've never talked about it on this podcast. So those are things that we definitely apologize for.
I think what everybody's seeing on either side is this is a crossroads. People are fed up. It's enough's enough, and I would love to redeem this moment as a moment where the civil rights movement, a new civil rights movement, can emerge. You know, and I think that's the hope of a lot of people, that this doesn't just die out. That this actually turns into legislation that corrects some of the problems that have been created by systemic racism.
Yeah, and which we're already seeing some positive things happening in that area. So
right, 1933. Okay, we're facing a housing shortage, and the federal government begins a program explicitly to increase America's housing stock. But it's also was a way, they saw this opportunity to form a segregation that was so deep-seated that despite people on both sides, there would still be this kind of subversive segregation that still exists today. By the way, I mean, just a sub-note, I mean, people talk about black-on-black crime. Some of those neighborhoods exist because, some of those bad neighborhoods, quote, exist because of this legislation that I'm about to share. So it's like, historically, it's a white caused problem. So the housing programs under the New Deal were like basically state sponsored segregation. Okay, and here's why: the Federal Housing Administration, which was established in 1934, they furthered these segregation efforts by refusing to insure mortgages in and near African American neighborhoods. Okay. This was a policy known as redlining. And they gave these high incentives and tax breaks to whites for getting houses, for taking out mortgages. This was to stimulate the economy, to get things going after the Depression. And so all this stuff is kind of happening. But in the meantime, they're also creating legislation to make sure, you know what, we're not going to insure mortgages near African American neighborhoods. And this is a policy known as redlining. Maybe you've heard that word before. It's a hot button issue, and I'm going to explain more why it's called redlining in a minute. That's not really the point. At the same time, the Federal Housing Administration was subsidizing builders who were mass producing entire subdivisions for whites, with the requirement that none of the homes be sold to African Americans. This is at a federal level. So these subsidies are coming, but hey, listen, don't sell to people of color because they're going to create a liability. And I'll get to that in a second, why they thought that. They actually didn't have a reason. But okay, in the book, The Color of Law, which is by Richard Rothenstein, I mean, he basically breaks down redlining and some other legislation that has not intentionally been undone. We've said that the results of it might be wrong. I don't think anybody would agree that segregation should exist, or that there should be a classism that is so black and white. But Richard Rothenstein says that these decades-old housing policies have had a lasting effect on American society. His quote from his book: "The segregation of our metropolitan areas today leads to stagnant inequality because families are much less able to be upwardly mobile." I don't know if you've ever heard that term, but upward mobility is just your natural, based on like the family you were born in, your ability to move your way through the economy, at least up to the middle class, if not into the upper classes. So it's this idea of being able to move into a place of really comfort and safety in neighborhoods here in the United States. So they were less able to be upwardly mobile when they're living in segregated neighborhoods where opportunity is absent. If we want greater equality in society, if we want a lowering of hostility between police and young African American men, we need to take steps to desegregate. So the argument today is, well, segregation, we share bathrooms now. We share water fountains now. Segregation doesn't exist anymore. No, we came a little bit further down the line, but the biblical word for justice, which is mishpat, means to make straight. And I've used this analogy before. I'm using it with my students now. We could, if racial equality was a signpost, we might have made it a little bit straighter over the years. Slavery is gone. All right, bringing it back up. Segregation in the sense that we don't use separate bathrooms. We're not separated at football games. Okay, it's a little bit straighter. But as long as segregation exists, as long as some of these other things exist, we have not achieved biblical justice, mishpat. We have not made straight this signpost of racial equality yet. And we have to admit that. That's step one. All we have to do first is to admit that, that desegregation is still necessary and that segregation still exists. Any thoughts so far?
I'm following.
Okay.
I'm following along.
So here's the Federal Housing Administration's justification back then. It was that if African Americans bought homes in these suburbs, or even if they bought homes near these suburbs, which I'm not going to get into that today, this afternoon, because I only have so many notes and I don't want to labor long in this, but they made it really hard for blacks to even come near these neighborhoods, creating a huge commute for a lot of potentially successful people of color. It was hard for them to get into the factories and some of the stuff that were booming at the time because they were so far out, and it was all very intentional.
And by the way, if you're wanting to learn more and get into more details, all the links to all these books, to that podcast, by the Holy Post, all that stuff's in the description. So go check it out.
The Federal Housing Administration's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in these suburbs or near them, the property values of the homes they were insuring would go down, and that the white homes they were insuring would also decline. So basically, they thought they were going to be putting loans at risk, and specifically for being insured. There was no basis for this claim whatsoever on part of the Federal Housing Administration. In fact, African Americans were coming to the table offering, which is wrong that they even had to do this. They were offering to pay more because they didn't have many options. They were offering to pay more to live in these nicer neighborhoods than the whites were, simply because their housing supply was so restricted and they had fewer choices. So this rationale that the Federal Housing Administration used had never based in any kind of study. It was never based on reality.
It was based on racism.
It was based on racism.
Yeah.
It's called a spade, right? The term redlining comes from the development by the New Deal, by the federal government, of maps of every metropolitan area. While these maps aren't specifically enforced anymore, they are still used to this day. If you're a realtor in certain areas, they're used in the sense that you know which areas are redlined and which ones are not. Again, you don't have to make sure that people buy in a particular neighborhood, but we're aware that this was a thing because there are maps that are used in realtor associations and in certain states. I was talking to somebody who works in realty, and they were talking, oh yeah, I know those codes, those maps are still out there.
Wow.
Those maps were color-coded by the First Homeowners Loan Corporation, and they were later adopted by the Veterans Administration. None of that really matters as much as these color codes were designated or designed to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Safe, right? That was a relative term. And anywhere where African Americans lived was red, and then there were other color codes for different, basically, classes, middle class and so forth. So I say all that to say that's where that term, it's one of the places, because this is just one example, but it's one of the places that systemic racism comes in, right? Because what I've established here is that there's still segregation. All right, so that's systemic racism. Segregation is systemic racism. It's caused by a system and it's yet to be repaired. The term white privilege comes from the fact that while there are exceptions to this rule, most of us were not born in red zones. Because, certainly none of us were, because we're white, and that there are exceptions to that rule. I've worked with students over the years, certainly that where it was flip-flopped, but that is the exception to the rule. And I will add to that, for example, in the past I've worked with students that are white but live in, red zones, basically, if you were to pull out a map and find that out. And they're in similar situations that a lot of, predominantly black communities are in. A single-parent home, they're exposed to drugs and other things like that, and that causes behavioral issues. But many people will refer to those kids as troubled kids because they're white, right? But if those same kids were black in a black neighborhood, they probably wouldn't say anything, because what they're thinking is it's because they're black or grow up in a black neighborhood. And I've experienced both. I've experienced just kind of a silence, like, those kids, we need to, and then I've seen this compassion, because those kids are troubled. There's a difference between a troubled kid anyway, sorry. I feel like I have to say that. I have to make that differentiation, even when there are exceptions to that rule, right? There's still this different look based on the color of somebody's skin. So anyway, that's the idea. So that's why white privilege comes in. Most of us are born because of blatantly racist legislation, are born into a place where we have a greater capacity for upward mobility. And you could say, well, they still have a capacity for upward mobility. Everybody has, some level of upward mobility. But, my analogy for that is it's like finding out your great-great-grandfather threw a person of color into a pit, or anybody, threw somebody into a pit. And they're down in there, and you discover them, and you're like, you know what, I need to help that person. You have a rope, you can pull them out, you can fill the hole, you can kind of be done with it. But instead, you throw down a ladder that's in 250,000 pieces, do it yourself, put it together. You know what I mean? Like, there's a difference in the amount of effort and struggle that it requires to be upwardly mobile when you are born in particular neighborhoods where many people of color do come from. And so, and I gotta be careful how much, like I said, I'm learning, and I would love if there are people of color listening and say, hey, I prefer you use this term, or I actually, you're wrong about this, this is how it is. I'm totally willing to learn, but I think that's where it needs to start for us, is like we're because we're born into white privilege, because we're born without this education automatically of segregation and how it still exists today, we, specifically as white people, have a responsibility to educate ourselves, to listen to our black brothers and sisters, and to learn from the past so we don't repeat it any longer. And so I say this with all humility. I'm not trying to be like, oh, I know everything. In fact, I would be ignorant saying all this stuff if I didn't say I haven't arrived. I'm still learning about how this works. But I'm aware of some of the facts, and you can't deny it. It's the way the system has been rigged against people of color, and so that's why I think that there's pushback. People are like, what about all lives matter? Well, I mean, if you do that, it kind of promotes color blindness at that point, and if you do that, then you remove some of the white problems. Like we don't have to face the music as white people. And then we also kind of, but we kind of look like we're supporting people of color.
Right. For the great majority of the people who are saying Black Lives Matter, of course all lives matter. That's a given.
Right.
Right. So that's not the conversation at hand. We're speaking out for a community that has been overlooked and oppressed for a very long time.
Yeah. The reason Black Lives Matter and that terminology exists, some people, again, they equate it to politics and stuff like that. It exists because you just saw from history the rhetoric, the message that this country has been sending. It is not anti-American to say this. The message that this country has been sending is that black lives do not matter. At least not as much as white lives.
Right. And there might be certain people who have taken that tag and made it the mantra for a certain political movement, or maybe even things that I wouldn't necessarily agree with or support. But that statement by itself is so true and so needs to be said, regardless. So.
And I think out of, if you look at everything, obviously I do believe that black people have suffered the most, but people of color extends beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
There are other brown people in this country that are struggling, including our Hispanic community, our Muslim community, and obviously right now we're talking about black lives and specifically that history, but this is going to spark a wider conversation of how do we handle. I mean, the reality is, if we keep going at the rate we're going, there is going to be a browning of America, and it should be a welcome thing. We're not going to be a majority, in a few thousand years, and so even maybe a few hundred years, and so we have to. This is an issue we have to address.
Yeah, and as Christians, again, I just keep going back. I don't engage this as a political issue. I engage this as a kingdom issue because I know there's going to be every tribe, every tongue, and every nation. So it's not something we have an option to ignore.
And to admit white privilege, or to admit that we've benefited from systemic racism, it is not saying that you are an immoral racist, you as an individual. And that's where white fragility really comes in, is we think our own morality is being attacked. And really, that's American individualism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you look at even biblical culture, the biblical Hebrews and the Jewish people, they viewed themselves as a collective. You know what I mean? And so if one person hurt, the whole community hurt. And if one person had a problem, it was a community problem. And so if our ancestors created a problem, we need to be part of the solution, you know, simply because we should be a collective, but this individualism, again, stays. So nobody's attacking you and your morality as an individual. We're just trying to figure out, okay, what has the collective response been to, people of color in this country, and how can it change for the better?
Yeah. Ryan, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really said much at all in this episode. That's because I am in a position of learning, and I don't know a lot. So my encouragement to you, or what I urge you to do, is just humble yourself. Even if what we're saying attacks what you've believed for a long time, to go into this topic with an open mind, to show humility in that. I think that's important.
Yeah, for sure, and
to not attach these issues to a specific political party, right? Like, too many people owe their allegiance to a certain political party today. Actually, for the past over 100 years, this has happened with political parties, and that just needs to stop. We're not attaching ourselves to a political party here by saying these things. We're just saying these are kingdom issues. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I think Johnny and I both echo what you're saying, is that we are in a stage of learning, and we need to always be. Mm-hmm. I think the only reason that maybe we both had a little more to say is maybe we've been researching this a little longer.
Yes, they know a little bit more than I do.
But we are not experts. We're learning, and we want to keep learning, and that's why the next few episodes will really be us sitting down with other black pastors and leaders in our community, and just having these conversations of, okay, what does this look like? Really hearing it from their perspective, and kind of flipping the table. Usually we're taking questions and answering them. That's kind of the format of the show. But now it's going to be our time to sit back and ask a few questions. And so I'm excited about those conversations. I think they're going to be really good and really important. And if you've gotten through to the end of the episode, then hopefully that means that you haven't unsubscribed to us, and that you're gonna join us for this journey of learning, which is really what this whole podcast is about. It's a space for students to discuss matters of faith and theology. We're students, and we're just letting you join us for a journey. Remember, all these resources that we've talked about today are linked in the description below. If you decide to buy one of those books, using those Amazon links that we provide actually kind of helps our channel and our podcast a little bit. So if you decide to do that, thank you. And we look forward to being able to talk more soon.